Thank you. So I actually went to a dinner party recently, and the man sitting to my right leaned over, and he whispered the most naughtiest gossip in my ear about the host. And I sort of realized, actually, that there are some secrets that are absolutely delicious, you know? Like the kind that your friend whispered to you on the playground as a kid, or the kind you get at a dinner party. But somehow the secrets in my childhood home, they weren't as nice. You know, they were dark. I knew that much, and they were absolutely off limits. It's a funny thing, I don't have any idea how I knew that my mother was in the Holocaust, because she never, ever talked about it. Never. When I asked her, she would run out of the room, nothing. But you know, that's the funny thing about secrets, right? They tumble out anyway, accidentally. And ours certainly did particularly around the Jewish holidays, like Yom Kippur, when there was a piano, and there would be so many memorial candles, one for every member of our family that had died in the camps, that the glow was blinding. Or Hanukkah, when my mother would take this beautiful candelabra and fill it with Hanukkah candles, beautiful array of Hanukkah candles, and stick it in the window, and then she'd quickly pull the shades down so nobody would know we were Jewish. Or Thanksgiving. We had this neighbor, Mr. Glassman, who was also a survivor, and he used to spend the holiday with us, and he had stolen a fork out of a Nazi kitchen with a swastika. It was heavy and silver and engraved in the handle, and he used to keep it hidden in the drawer in his basement, and he only took it out once a year at Thanksgiving to carve the turkey at our house. No explanation. No, so my mother never talked about the Holocaust, but you know, it was there. It was in our food. You could never get enough food in our house. We had 3 refrigerators. In fact, I remember once there was a sale on cat food. My mother bought about 30 cans. We didn't have a cat. One night I was hungry, and I went into one of those many refrigerators. I opened up the freezer, and about 40 frozen chickens came out and fell on my feet. So I started to put them back, and I saw that one had been there for so long it was green and moldy on the inside. So I threw it away. When my mother found out, she almost had a heart attack. It turns out the green was really a roll of $200 she'd hid inside the head of the chicken. She said, "You never know when it can all be taken away." And then my father admitted for years he'd been finding money hidden in the strangest places, you know. No, she really never, ever talked about it. We knew. You know, it was in our everyday childhood activities, like walking down the block to pick up my brother from kindergarten. I mean, the route was always the same. You know, I would hold my mother's hand up there, and we would walk down Virginia Avenue in Clifton, New Jersey. We'd go past the ice cream store, and if I was lucky, I'd get a creamsicle. Then we'd go around the corner where the mean-spirited Lapuzzo twins, these evil guys, were always up to no good on the front lawn. And then we'd walk past these factories, and they were always churning out billows of smoke. And every day, the situation was exactly the same. My mother would squeeze my hand so tight that I would sense terror in her, but I didn't understand it as a 3-year-old. But years later, I figured it out. Those ugly gray billows of smoke must have reminded her of the crematoria that her family had been killed in. One summer, she decided to take us kids swimming at the lake in the neighborhood. And I remember she threw us in the back of the station wagon, the lime green station wagon. Me, my brother, my 2 cousins. And we were singing, 99 bottles of beer on the wall, 99 bottles of beer. We were having such a great time driving down the New Jersey Turnpike. But there was a construction roadblock ahead. And the police were redirecting traffic with their flashing lights and their uniforms. When my mother saw that, something in her snapped. And she pulled the car over to the side of the road. She told us kids to lie with our faces flat on the bottom of the car. She went out and got a blanket out of the trunk and covered us up until she could talk her way out of the roadblock, right? Because to my mother, everything was survival. Even the most joyous acts became symbols of survival. And guess what? I inherited that trait. Like her, I also couldn't discern between real and imaginary enemies. When my friends would be lying in bed at night dreaming that Prince Charming was coming through the window and taking them away, I'd be dreaming that the Nazis were coming through mine, and I'd practice outwitting them the way my mother had. What I'm really talking about here now is intergenerational trauma. That wily, mean, deceptive, insidious phenomenon that so often gets transmitted from a traumatized parent to their child, often without the mother even realizing it. So listen, before I was born, when I was still in my mother's womb, when she was pregnant with me, she was inadvertently passing down to me a host of epigenetic markers that made it easier, right, for me to turn on unhealthy genes. That made it easier for me to succumb to diseases like cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and addiction. That made it easier for my stress hormones to run amok, for my cortisol to not work properly, thereby affecting my adrenals, my pituitary, my thyroid, and a host of other problems. I mean, don't get me wrong. I didn't only inherit bad things from my mother. I'll say that right now. I inherited some good things too: my resilience, my capacity for survival, which I'll have you note I used several times in New York City over the last few years. I think I inherited heightened empathy and sense of compassion, which is not a bad thing. And I think I kind of became hyper-intuitive and almost witchy with my radar, which really helps me as when I work as a story coach now in companies, helping employees to figure out what their story is. But I also inherited a lifetime, right, of fear-based thinking and stressors. And it took me the better half of my adult life to deconstruct those old stories and to try to reconstruct new ones so that I could have somewhat of a functional existence, right? To date, the Netherlands has taken in upwards of 70,000 refugees from Ukraine. That's in addition to the thousands of refugees from other war-torn countries, such as Somalia, Syria, Afghanistan, to name a few, right? Not everybody, of course, will stay here, but those that do and decide to integrate will inevitably have offspring that will become our neighbors, our shopkeepers, our friends, our school teachers, our politicians, our decision makers. And unless we give them the support that they need now, those decisions are very likely to be less than healthy, fueled by exactly the same kinds of stressors, the same kinds of fear-based thinking that absolutely plagued us, the children of Holocaust survivors. When I was coming of age, which was like the 19th century, okay? We didn't understand post-traumatic stress disorder. We didn't understand the mechanisms surrounding intergenerational trauma. We didn't know anything about the epigenetic transmission. It was really a new field, and as a result, virtually no therapy was given to survivors. There was very, very few groups. In fact, I was in one of the very first groups of children of Holocaust survivors where we hired a therapist and, began to talk about it. And as a result, I tended to witness and observe and even participate in some pretty dangerous and scary behavior. That's just what happened. And I wanted to share with you some of those stories that I observed, particularly as a professional storyteller on the road in the education community. Why? I want to share it as a kind of cautionary tale for what can happen if the support and the understanding of the need for intergenerational transmissional support isn't given now. So in the late 1990s, early 2000s, I wrote a one-woman show called What Mother Never Told Me about my experiences growing up as the child of a Holocaust survivor. Actually, that's what brought me to Amsterdam in the first place. Zavira Hollander brought me to perform in her theater. That's how I came here. But when I was doing it in America, every April was Holocaust Memorial Week. And so I would get invited to speak at schools, all across America, right? Now, 99.9% of the education directors that were hiring me for those programs were children of Holocaust survivors. First of all, they were passionate about the subject. They felt personally involved in it, and they were convinced they were the really only people that should be managing these programs, right? How wrong they were. How wrong we all were. We just weren't ready. We did not have the self-awareness. We did not have the objectivity to be handling such an important educational subject. So just to give you an example, I got hired one year to tell stories in Potomac, Maryland. It's a very sleepy, wealthy suburb outside of Washington, D.C. I was hired to perform at a high school. The man that hired me worked for the State Department, but his son was in that school, and he was chairing the Holocaust Committee. And he was so excited about the new initiatives that he couldn't wait to share them with me, right? So I get to the school, and I can't believe what I'm seeing. Black train tracks have been painted all along the driveway leading up to the doorway of the suburban high school, and he's written Arbeit macht frei over the doorway, recreating the gates of Auschwitz. When I questioned him about it, he was very defensive. He didn't even know what I was talking about. It was futile, so I left. I went to a school, a private school, a posh private school in New York City, and I was hired to tell stories to high school students there. At 1:30 in the morning, the night before my performance, I was awakened by a phone call from the school principal, a child of a Holocaust survivor. She was absolutely frantic. I mean, she was heaving and shaking. I said, "Are you okay? Was there a fire? Did somebody die?" She said, "No, I'm just really worried. Do you promise you'll make the kids cry tomorrow?" I said, maybe, but remember, the most important thing here is the question and answer session afterwards. I calmed her down and she agreed, but the next day when I got to the school, she had cut out my question and answer session, and she had quickly substituted a Holocaust survivor who shared the most chilling, grotesque survival stories of her existence. Atlanta, Georgia. The head of the entire Board of Jewish Education, a child of a Holocaust survivor, she couldn't wait to show me the video footage that she had created for the 9th grade Holocaust curricula. And she said to me, quote, she goes, "I picked the most horrifying footage you can imagine. The ones with the corpses piled up high, the ovens. She said, I really got to get to these kids, But perhaps the scariest story, in case I haven't scared you already, is Omaha, Nebraska. I was hired to help kids in high school bring to life their Holocaust curricula. But remember, these were 4th generation kids, Americans, with no understanding or association with the Holocaust whatsoever, even Europe for that matter. And I thought the best way to approach it would be to run a workshop which had storytelling and improvisation on contemporary issues of racism and hatred, and then draw parallels to the Holocaust, right? And the workshop went great. I mean, the kids were into it. We had great discussions. And I could see the principal outside the door, and he was watching. So when he called me to his office, I kind of thought he would tell me what a great job I did. But he gave me a tongue lashing. He said, "What does that have to do with Holocaust?" He goes, "You know what I do? The curricula is 6 months long, and every week for 6 months, I pretend to be an SS officer. I march into the classroom and I bark orders at them. And then at the very last class, I lift them up and I pretend to march them to the gas chambers. And when they rebel, I'm ready for them." And he reached under his desk and he took out a plastic water pistol and shot it at me. And it hit me in the forehead, and I stared at him, and all I could think of is, get me to the airport as fast as you can. Now, crazy? Maybe, but not uncommon. More common than not. And I should add, not even when it was a Holocaust subject. Not even when it was a Holocaust. I remember being hired to tell stories on Earth Day, celebrating the environment and nature at an inner city school in Manhattan, right? What could be more fun than that? I got out my styrofoam frog costume. I got out my musical instruments because I wanted to sing and dance and rap my way into environmental awareness with these little kids, right? But the principal of the school, a child of a Holocaust survivor, insisted on introducing me. How? How do you think? By talking about arboricide, the murder of 4 trees by teen vandals earlier that week in Queens. I mean, here we had all of Central Park to celebrate, and he could only think of a word I'd only never heard of before, arboricide. But perhaps the most illuminating story, and by the way, these are stories I've never shared before. This is the first time in all these years. This is perhaps the most illuminating story of all. I was asked to train Jewish educators at a conference in New Jersey. They wanted me to show them ways of bringing the Jewish holidays to life in a proactive, joyous way. And I thought to myself, let me model this workshop, right, after the ones I used to do for history teachers in the public school. I would train educators in how to bring history to life. I might tell the kids to become an object on the dinner table of a Dutchman in New Amsterdam or a Revolutionary War soldier and describe the objects they saw as a way of recalling their lessons. So I put the Jewish educators through a similar activity. I adjusted it a little. I said, become an object on the Passover Seder table, and tell me about that. For those of you that don't know, Passover is one of our feast days celebrating the Exodus, and the table is filled with ritual objects. I was absolutely shocked by their responses. Every single educator became a persecuted object. I was the wine that fell on the floor. I was the matzah that was crushed. I was the glass that fell over and smashed. I mean, here they were mandated to teach a subject with joyous proactivity, right? And they had no idea they were harboring such a sense of victimization and persecution. Even with their best intentions, it lay so deep within them. It lay deep within us. I mean, the truth of the matter is intergenerational trauma is real. It is insidious. It clings and it holds and it insinuates itself into our fiber, our being, our genes, into everything. That is a fact. But the good news is it is not etched in stone. Its effects can be mediated. Those epigenetic markers I described to you, according to most scientists, they can be reversed. Those stress hormones that surge from the children of survivors, the cortisol, it can be abated and it can be redirected. Changes can be made. How? By providing ample amounts and easily available amounts of cutting edge therapy, which accentuates the field of intergenerational trauma, which takes into account the physiologic, the cultural, the psychological components. We must provide that not just to the refugees of today, but to their offspring as well. We also, I believe, have to be mindful of how we collect the stories of refugees as they come in. We have to not re-traumatize them, and the way that we hear and the way that we pull out is as important as the information that comes. We have to recognize that not all silence means no story, and we have to be mindful of that. And as individuals, I think most importantly, we have to be curious. We have to be so curious because if and when a traumatized war victim or their offspring is ready to talk, if they're ready to talk, what a wonderful, incredibly healing, incredibly special gift you can give them by simply being curious. I tell you right now that intergenerational trauma can be mediated. And if we follow these measures, I firmly believe that the next generation of survivors can walk into the future knowing that while some secrets, right, are dark and off limits, some, like the kind that are whispered to you on a playground or the kind that come at a dinner party, those are absolutely delicious. Thank you.